Hi everyone, I'm Nick Fortin, Deer and Moose Project Leader for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. In this presentation, I'm going to go over the changes to deer, moose, and turkey hunting regulations that the department has proposed to the Fish and Wildlife Board.
But before we get into the proposed changes, I want to quickly touch on where we are in this process. So the department presented these changes to the Fish and Wildlife Board in February, and the board voted to put them out for public comment. We are now in the public comment period, which will be open until May 25th. We recently held 3 public hearings around the state in March, and we'll hold 2 additional hearings in early May. Now, this is the same presentation that's given at these hearings. It's available on our website for anyone who is interested. So the board will take a second vote on these proposed changes in June, and with a final vote hopefully occurring in July or August. That will give us enough time to get any changes that do pass included in the 2026 Hunting Law Digest. And so it's very important here to understand that if any of these changes pass and they're approved by the board, they would not take effect until 2026. The first proposed change we'll touch on is to the turkey archery season. Currently, turkey archery season begins the first Saturday in October and extends for about 3 weeks. We've proposed to change the dates of this season so it would start on October 1st each year, just like the deer archery season, and would extend until the Friday before the regular rifle deer season in November. This would roughly double the length of the turkey archery season and make it consistent with the main early portion of the deer archery season. Now, a relatively small number of turkeys are taken during the archery season currently, so this is not expected to have a significant impact on the overall fall archery turkey harvest. The next change we've proposed is to our carcass import rule. So if you hunt outside of Vermont in a state or province that has detected chronic wasting disease, or CWD, this is the rule that makes it illegal to bring the whole carcass or certain high-risk parts back to Vermont. We are proposing to update this rule so that it applies to all species in the deer family, not just deer and elk, since they are all susceptible to CWD. We feel this is a necessary and probably overdue update to ensure that we continue to do everything we can to keep CWD out of Vermont. Now, the next set of proposed changes is to our moose management rule. We've proposed 2 changes here, establishing a special opportunity season and extending the length of the regular moose season. So the department issues up to 3 special opportunity permits each year to individuals with life-threatening illnesses who are sponsored by a charitable organization such as Hunt of a Lifetime. Last year, the board received a petition requesting that these hunters be allowed to hunt during the archery moose season, but with a firearm. Our archery moose season is the first 7 days of October, during the peak of the moose rut. Special opportunity permit holders often have mobility challenges that make it difficult to get within range of a moose, and allowing them to hunt during the rut would give them a better chance of calling a moose to within range. Creating a separate season, as we're proposing here, that is concurrent with the archery season is the simplest way to allow these hunters to hunt with a gun at that time. The hope is that this change would provide these hunters with a better overall hunting experience, which is consistent with the intent of these special opportunity permits. The other proposed change is to the regular moose season, which starts the 3rd Saturday in October and currently extends for 6 days. So that means it ends on a Thursday. That's a bit of an odd time to end a season, so we've proposed adding 3 days on the back end, which would include another weekend. The key benefits of this change are that it would provide more flexibility for moose hunters, particularly those that may not be able to get time off during the week, and it would provide for more consistency for us as managers. Short hunting seasons are very susceptible to impacts from unfavorable weather conditions, and we've seen that firsthand during our moose season in recent years. Last year, it was very hot and dry for the first 5 days of the season, which resulted in unusually low success rates and a lower than expected moose harvest. A longer season would have helped moderate those impacts. Right? It keeps success rates more consistent, which makes the harvest more predictable. Importantly, this change would not affect the total number of moose harvested each year, as we control that by the number of permits that are issued. This is just an attempt to provide more flexibility for hunters and more consistency for managers. Now, next, we'll cover the proposed changes to the deer management rule. So there are 7 proposed changes. Some are relatively minor and won't affect many hunters, and some are significant. But we'll walk through each one of these. First, we've proposed to establish 8 expanded archery zones. Most of these focus on developed areas around major cities and towns where we cannot effectively manage deer numbers with firearms. Within these zones, the archery season would start September 15th and would be for antlerless deer only until the regular archery season starts on October 1st. Since these will be the only areas open to hunting at that time, the beginning of the season, when everyone is itching to go, the hope is that it'll entice some hunters to hunt in these areas and maybe focus some of our archery antlerless harvest on these areas where it is very much needed. Now, realistically, few hunters are going to be interested in hunting in these heavily developed areas, and access is going to be a challenge. So we expect this to have little impact on the overall archery harvest, but again, it's one of the few tools we have to attempt to manage deer in these areas. The next proposed change is to move the youth weekend back to the weekend before the regular rifle season in November. This is actually undoing a change we made 5 years ago. At the time, the youth weekend was moved 2 weeks earlier to put it ahead of the new October muzzleloader season and continue to offer youth hunters the first opportunity to take deer with a gun. It was also thought that the earlier timing would provide more favorable weather and perhaps increase participation. But that's not what happened. Following the move, the youth weekend harvest has been considerably lower than it was before, and it turned out that participation actually declined after the season was moved up. Additionally, success rates have been lower during the earlier season. In the past, success rates were consistently around 25%, but in the past 4 years, they've been around 21%. Now, that may not seem like much, but it equates to about 180 fewer successful youth hunters each year, and that would have added almost 20% to recent youth weekend harvests, accounting for most of that decline that we've observed. Now, lower success rates could be partly due to deer activity, with the earlier season timing kind of moving the season out of that early rut or pre-rut period when bucks are really active. But it appears that a lot of this was actually related to lower hunting effort, mainly due to conflicts with other activities like fall sports. So most fall sports are still going on in late October, whereas by early November, most are done unless they're in a state championship. Now, anecdotally, we've heard from many families over the past 5 years, that they were only able to hunt one day or maybe only part of one day because of a conflict, like a football game or a soccer game that weekend. And now, the youth weekend is very important both for recruiting new hunters and for collecting important biological data on the health of the deer herd. So we'd really like to address this issue if we can. The next proposed change is also undoing a change that was made 5 years ago. We are proposing to reinstate the antler point restriction, or APR, in Wildlife Management Unit D1. Now, Vermont hunters overwhelmingly support management to increase the number of older, larger bucks on the landscape. So these results here are from a survey conducted in the spring of 2024, which found that 68% of our deer hunters support managing for older, larger bucks, and only 11% oppose that type of management. So to that end, the department has established buck age structure goals in our 2020 to 2030 big game management plan, as well as strategies for achieving those goals. One of the strategies for achieving those buck age structure goals is to ensure that no more than 50% of the buck harvest is yearling bucks, or 1.5-year-old bucks. So the percent of yearlings in the harvest is an indicator of the harvest rate, or the percent of all bucks that are killed by hunters each year. A high percentage of yearlings means most of the available bucks are being killed by hunters, so few are surviving into those older age classes. And we determined that if you get to about 50% yearlings in the harvest, that's kind of the tipping point. Above that, not enough bucks are surviving to those older age classes to meet those desires of most hunters. Now, in recent years, WMU D1 has been consistently above 50% yearlings in the harvest. Importantly, it is also the only WMU that saw a substantial decline in the number of older bucks harvested each year. So the total number of bucks harvested in D1 has increased substantially since the APR was removed, but the number of older bucks taken has declined substantially. So clearly, current regulations are not working in this WMU, and so to achieve our established buck age structure goals, we feel we need to reinstate the antler point restriction. So our map of antler point restrictions by WMU would change from this currently to this. It creates two separate areas without the antler restriction, but it's actually a better reflection of habitat, hunting pressure, and all of the other factors that affect the need for these sort of restrictions. Our next proposed change is to allow hunters to take a conditional second buck. So currently, hunters can only take 1 buck per year. We're proposing to allow hunters to take a second buck if they purchase a second buck tag, which would be a new tag available in 2026. Their first buck has at least 3 points on one antler, and they harvest an antlerless deer. Now, the order in which they do these things wouldn't matter, but as long as they meet these 3 requirements, they'd be able to try to take a second buck. Now, importantly, hunters would still only be allowed to take 1 buck per season. So if they took their first buck during archery season, they couldn't take another buck during archery season, even if they met all these requirements. Now, based on the number of hunters that would have qualified for this opportunity in recent years, and assuming that all of them actually tried to take a second buck, which isn't realistic, but assuming that, we would still expect fewer than 100 hunters to actually take a second buck. So this isn't expected to have a substantial impact on the buck harvest, or probably even the antlerless harvest. The primary reason we're recommending this change is to encourage people to hunt more, and specifically hunt in Vermont more, and buck tags get hunters in the woods. One of the primary complaints we've received since going to a 1 buck limit is that some hunters aren't hunting as much as they used to, particularly during the archery season, but also the muzzleloader season. In the case of archery hunters, we often hear that they don't want to take a buck and give up their rifle season, but they also don't want to have to pass what is a fairly rare opportunity at a decent buck. so they have less incentive to even go hunting. Now, while that reduction in the buck harvest is a major value of the 1 buck limit, we also want to keep hunters in the field as much as possible, particularly those hunters who are willing to take antlerless deer. So we believe this change can offer this additional opportunity to hunters while still maintaining the benefits of the 1 buck limit and incentivizing perhaps a little additional antlerless harvest. Now, our next proposed change is to allow hunters to hold 2 antlerless permits at one time. Currently, a hunter can only hold 1 permit at a time, but can purchase additional leftover permits if they're available after they fill the first permit. Under this proposal, a hunter would still only be able to get 1 permit via the lottery, which is as is currently the case. This ensures that everyone who might want a permit has a chance to get 1 permit before anyone can get a second one. But then after the lottery, if there are unallocated permits available, a hunter could then purchase a second antlerless permit in a different WMU. So they could still only hold 1 permit per WMU at a time. Now, the reason for this change is that we now regularly have WMUs where we are unable to sell all of our available antlerless permits. And we have hunters hunting in those WMUs who are unable to purchase those permits because they already have a permit in a different WMU. So in 2024, all of the WMUs in red and orange on this map had leftover permits at the end of the year. So as an example here, I live in WMU-K, which regularly has hundreds of unallocated antlerless permits available. If I invite someone to hunt at my place who maybe normally hunts elsewhere and so they got a permit in a different WMU, they can't currently purchase any of those available K permits, even though we know we're not going to end up selling them. And that doesn't make sense, right? This isn't going to address the bigger issue here, and that's where the next change we'll talk about comes in. But given our current situation with these leftover permits and how common they are, we feel we can loosen this restriction a little bit. Now, the reason we are keeping a cap of 2 permits, no more than 2 at a time, and no more than 1 per WMU, is so people won't be able to hoard permits that they won't actually end up using. And that brings us to our most controversial proposed change, which is to allow antlerless permits to be used during the regular rifle season in November. So currently, our antlerless permits can only be used during the muzzleloader seasons in October and December. This would allow those same permits to also be used during the regular rifle season. Now, we are well aware of how controversial this is among some Vermont hunters, and I'll touch on some of the history around this in a bit. But there is also considerable misunderstanding here among many hunters about what we're actually proposing and what it might mean for your local deer herd. First, I want to touch on how Vermont hunters actually feel about this idea. So we asked about this in a representative survey of Vermont deer hunters that was conducted last spring, and there was considerably more support than opposition. And this has certainly changed over time, but the reality is that many hunters are now supportive of this change. And if we look only at those hunters who only hunt the regular season, which, as you'll see shortly, is a large percentage of our hunters, they are actually more supportive of this change. Now, these hunters currently have no opportunity to take antlerless deer. But perhaps the most interesting and telling breakdown as we try to understand how Vermont hunters feel about this is if we look at this by age. Younger hunters, those under 55 in this case, are strongly supportive of this change, while older hunters are mostly opposed. And this makes sense when we consider the history of this. Hunters over 65 are old enough to have been hunting the last time this was allowed in the early 1980s, and they saw firsthand the impact that it had on the deer herd. However, that impact and the experience of those few years in the early 80s had much more to do with how the department approached and managed this at the time than it did with it simply being legal to take antlerless deer during rifle season. The department was far too aggressive in the 80s in attempting to reduce the deer herd, and we have absolutely no interest in doing anything remotely close to that today. For comparison, in 1980, there were about twice as many hunters as we have today, and the department issued nearly twice as many antlerless permits as we did in 2024. And last year, 2024, followed the easiest winter on record and was a record high permit allocation under our current system where we do it during muzzleloader season. The difference in antlerless harvests here is even more stark, especially considering that there was no muzzleloader season in 1980, so all of that permitted antlerless harvest occurred during the rifle season. Now, there are a few areas today where we would like to take more antlerless deer, but the total antlerless harvest wouldn't increase much from what we accomplished last year. We do not want to do anything close to what happened in the early 80s. It wouldn't be defensible, and it wouldn't be consistent with our current management objectives. Right? We are not going to repeat the 80s. I also want to spend some time here going over how we make or achieve our antlerless harvest recommendations each year, because I think there's a lot of confusion around this. Every year, the department comes to the Fish and Wildlife Board in late April, after winter is over and we have all of our data, and for each wildlife management unit, we recommend a target number of antlerless deer to be harvested. Now, this changes a bit each year based on whether the population is increasing or decreasing, whether it's above or below our population objectives, and to some extent on the health and physical condition of deer in that WMU. But the key point here is that the primary thing we're recommending is a target number of antlerless deer to take, not how or when to take them. And that brings me to another important distinction, so I'll interrupt here. But there are two separate processes that people often and understandably mix up. So every year we go through our antlerless harvest recommendation procedure, which I'm talking about here. This is a relatively quick process. We make a recommendation to the board in late April, it goes out for public comment, and the board votes on it in May. So it takes about a month. All that process does is determine how many antlerless deer we're going to try to take in each WMU each year, right? Including, as part of that, how many antlerless permits to issue. And the board also can control whether antlerless deer can be taken in the archery and youth seasons. But that's it. That is different and separate from the hunting regulation change process, which we are going through right now and is what this presentation is all about. This is a much longer, more complex process. From the time we develop some ideas and vet them internally, write the rule language, introduce it to the board, go through the public comment period, get it approved and passed, get it in the hunting law digest, and actually implemented, we're looking at 2 years easily to get through this entire process, assuming it all goes smoothly. So we try to do this a lot less often, but this is where we set all of our other hunting regulations, like the length and timing of seasons, things like bag limits, and importantly in this case, when antlerless permits can be used. So back to our antlerless harvest process. So now we have a target number of antlerless deer we'd like to harvest in our target WMU here. So how do we get there? First, we have some antlerless harvest from the archery and youth and novice seasons. Now, as I mentioned, the board has the power to turn this on or off, but if it's on, any hunter during these seasons can take antlerless deer. But these seasons are kind of self-limiting, either because of the implements hunters have to use in the case of archery season, or just because it's a small number of hunters in the case of youth season. Importantly, though, the antlerless harvest during these seasons is pretty consistent from year to year, and that makes it fairly predictable. Then, to get the rest of the way up to our target antlerless harvest, we use antlerless permits. And since we control the number of antlerless permits available each year, we can really fine-tune this portion of the total antlerless harvest to get us very close to that target harvest. But the problem we're running into today is that in some of our WMUs, in some years, we can't distribute enough antlerless permits to reach our target harvests. As an example, if we were trying to harvest a total of 300 antlerless deer in this imaginary WMU here, and say we expect about 160 to be taken in the archery and youth seasons, we need to take another 140 antlerless deer with antlerless permits. Now, the fill rate on our antlerless permits is currently about 14%. Now, we tried to increase this 5 years ago by creating that October muzzleloader season, but it had no effect whatsoever on fill rates. So, if we have a 14% fill rate and we're trying to harvest 140 antlerless deer, we need to issue 1,000 antlerless permits in our imaginary WMU to hit our target. Now, in some WMUs, we may not have that many muzzleloader hunters. And that's exactly the problem we're running into. In those WMUs where we need to issue a lot of permits to get to our target antlerless harvests, we simply don't have enough muzzleloader hunters to take the permits. Now, we have more than enough hunters, just not enough muzzleloader hunters. Only 44% of our active hunters hunt during the muzzleloader seasons, shown by the blues and greens in this figure. There are another 37% of our hunters who only hunt during the regular season and currently cannot obtain antlerless permits. And there's another 15% who hunt archery and the regular season, but not muzzleloader. Now, yes, those hunters can take antlerless deer during the archery season, but they also can't obtain antlerless permits. So this proposal is about expanding antlerless harvest opportunities to a pretty large group of our hunters, and also allowing us to meet our antlerless harvest targets in the WMUs where we do occasionally come up short under our current regulations. But I want to be very clear here that the number of antlerless deer we try to take each year in each WMU isn't going to change, regardless of whether this part passes or not. All we'd be changing is which seasons those antlerless deer are taken in. And lastly, I will add that if this does pass, most WMUs, especially those where we currently meet our antlerless harvest targets, will likely see fewer antlerless permits available each year. So rationally, we would expect that if people can fill antlerless permits during the rifle season, the fill rate will likely be higher than the current 14%. And so we would adjust permit numbers accordingly so that we are still hitting that target antlerless harvest, which again, isn't going to change. And that brings us to the last proposed change, which is to remove the archery season closure during the regular season. Currently, archery season runs up until the Friday right before the regular season, then it's closed for 16 days, and then it reopens the Monday after the regular season. The primary reason for this closure has to do with law enforcement concerns around archery hunters potentially taking antlerless deer during a season when antlerless deer can't otherwise be taken. However, if the previous change passes and antlerless deer can be taken during the regular season, then this is no longer a significant concern, and we can remove this closure and allow archery season to run straight through, just as it does with the muzzleloader seasons currently. Now, few hunters will choose a bow over a rifle, so this isn't expected to have any substantial impact on the harvest, but it adds a little more opportunity for avid bow hunters, and it greatly simplifies our hunting regulations. For more information or to comment on these proposed hunting regulation changes, visit vtfishandwildlife.com.